became convinced of the truth of creation. And they are founders and directors of Alpha Omega Institute and have been teaching creation science for over 40 years. They have advanced degrees in math and biology and geology and believe in lifelong learning, most of which they say occurred after they finished university. Both have taught at the high school and college level, and all 5 of the presentations are being live streamed on our YouTube channel, which the QR code is on the flyer on the back table. So, without further ado, please welcome Mary Jo Nutting.
Thanks, Parnell. Well, like Parnell said, we do believe in lifelong learning. And I think when you're in the university, you're so busy with classes and assignments that sometimes the topics you really wish you could study more, you don't have time. And so once you're out of school, you start having more time to do those things. We're going to talk today about, was Darwin wrong? About blind chance, or did life come about really, and all the changes we see in life all the time as a result of a grand design? Now face it, Darwin didn't know everything. We don't know everything. Sometimes I think the more that we learn, the less that we actually know, or we learn that there's so much more to learn than what we really think we know. And so keep learning, it's a good thing. So many people think, as I did when I was younger, in college and so on, evolution science, they think. They think creation is a religious myth. And that's very common to think that. But over the years, as we've really studied into this, we believe evolution is a belief system that's posing as science. It's a philosophical worldview interpretation of the evidence, because the evidence can be looked at 2 different ways. Naturalism is more of a philosophical viewpoint that says everything in the universe can be explained by natural processes only, without a God. And some people define science that way, as naturalism. As a believer in Jesus, as a Bible believer, I would look at science a little differently. I see science as studying this world that God has made. And we come up with different interpretations then of people that study it from a naturalistic point of view. However, evolutionary naturalism is the only thing that's taught mostly in the schools. And that was true when I was in school. I think it's still true today that we're seeing this idea of naturalism, that your worldview really can affect your interpretation of the data. I would propose to you that we have the same data, whether we believe in evolution or we believe in creation. We have the same data to study. We're studying a natural world. If I study a rock, I can measure it, I can test it, I can do the specific gravity, we can do all kinds of things with that rock. Those things should finches. Well, it's very interesting now. What did you start with? Start with finches. What do you end up with? Finches, right? Nothing fundamentally new. Now, yes, you see variations with different characteristics. These finches. It's interesting, though, there's been modern research done on these famous Galapagos finches. And the grants were studied for 40 years. You need me to put that on? Or is it good there?
Yeah, it would help if you put that on.
Okay, hang on 1 second. I need to see if I can get it on. Yep. I know what the problem is. It's going the wrong way. Yeah, maybe I can put it on here. I might need help. I broke my wrist about 6 weeks ago. Don't try flying like Superman off of 3 steps outdoors. It doesn't work. I found out I couldn't fly. It's getting better. So anyway, with the finches, we start out with finches, we end up with finches. The finches are, yes, we see different characteristics within the different finches. A lot of times those have even been classified as different species, but the interesting thing is the modern research is showing that these supposed species can crossbreed still. So are they really species? That's a definitional thing, really. But Darwin's finches now, what they're finding is that they're very much related to changes within the environment. And people are thinking that are studying these now, scientists are thinking maybe that it has something to do more with epigenetics than with the actual DNA. And epigenetics is chemical markers that are on top of the DNA, you might say. The DNA doesn't change, but the markers will tell which sections of DNA to turn on or turn off according to environmental conditions and so on. That's a very simplistic idea, but we don't have time today to go in depth in that. Jeffrey Tompkins, a biologist, has said this: scientists have discovered that the genes are very similar among the various species. They discovered that epigenetics correlated closely with beak size and shape among the species. Epigenetic mechanisms clearly remain a major player in adaptation. And they're doing more research on that. This is from the studies that were done by the husband-wife team, the Grants. They started their studies back in the 70s. They studied for over 40 years of research on these finches. They say that they observed beak size changes with periods of drought, and it seems to be an adaptive epigenetics, which means that as the environmental conditions change, something changes within that organism that turns on or turns off different parts of the gene expression. If you're interested in that, we can point you to some good research on that. What about peppered moths? Peppered moth is classic, been used as evidence of natural selection. And the whole idea was that before the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, that there were 2 varieties of moths. One was light and one was dark. They were same species, basically, but the varieties were different. At that time, they say there were more light moths than dark moths because the air was nice and clean and the light ones could be better camouflaged on the tree bark and so on. And then after they started burning coal and they polluted the air and the tree bark became dark, you see more dark moths than light ones. And that idea was called the industrial melanism. They actually gave a name to it. Well, what's the problem? When you look at that, what do you see? You start out with moths, both dark ones and light ones. Usually I didn't catch that when I was a student, that they had both of them to start with. But they had both of them to start with. What did they end up with? Light and dark moths, just differing numbers of each one, nothing fundamentally new. So is this good evidence of evolution? Further research on these moths have shown that they are nocturnal. They fly around at night. In the daytime, they gather up in the leaves of the trees, And they're not even known to rest naturally on the bark of the tree. And so the pictures, the classic pictures you see, had to be stuck, those moths have to be stuck on there or drawn on there or something to get the classic pictures you see. What do we find out, really? There are moths, there are dark moths, there are light ones. It hasn't even been observed that they're differentially picked off of the trees by birds. And so it may be totally just a bogus example in the long run. Really doesn't have much to do with evolution. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria, we hear a lot about that with changes in bacteria where they can become just resistant to certain kinds of antibiotics or viruses, and we see the way that things supposedly evolve. Well, let's think about that a minute. You start with bacteria, you end up with bacteria, nothing fundamentally new. Now, yes, if you take a petri dish and you grow a population of bacteria and you throw a new antibiotic on it, some of them probably will survive and some probably won't. And then if you take the ones that survive and you start breeding them, yes, you'll get a more resistant population. But is that really, it comes down to saying, what is the origin of that trait? It had to come someplace that they would be resistant. Then, of course, once you get the resistant ones, they can continue to reproduce and so on. But the question becomes, what do you get? Anything fundamentally new, or was the ability to survive there in the first place? And that's a question that requires more research. We believe that, and I'll show you later, some of the current research that's going on that is showing more of an indication of continuous environmental tracking by organisms. In other words, they have something built in already to respond to the environment. This was always a question of mine. I loved the study of DNA back in the dark ages when I went to school. That was a long time ago. But I loved it. And I loved the way that, the DNA molecule could be transcripted and changed or used as the model, and we could get proteins from that. I thought it was wonderful. But since my early years in school, things have changed a lot, and we know so much more about the DNA. But one thing I couldn't understand all those years was how, in order for the DNA to help an organism survive in an environment, you've got to have a tracking system coming from the environment, telling the individual what the need is at that point in time, and then you have to have a way to respond to it. And just the genetics alone didn't do that. And now what they're finding is this epigenetic system that is able to turn on and turn off differing parts of genes. But the question then becomes is, how do you get those different parts of genes in the first place? Do they just happen by accident? Well, the more you look at it, the more and more complex the system becomes. And I right now, I just look at that and I go, wow. You either have to have a whole lot of faith in chance and accidents, or you might have faith in a creator, an intelligent designer, somebody that knew ahead of time what these organisms would need to survive. Here's one that's, I guess it's pretty current, is how did we get all the different races that we see in the world today? Darwin thought that the different races came from 5 different species, different kinds of apes or monkeys, and that some were more evolved than others. Now, he applied that then, and his ideas, remember, were mid-1800s. And if you look at the history of that time period, colonialism in Africa was big, and the white people came into Africa and they taught the blacks that they were less evolved. In fact, we had a couple of our co-workers that went to Africa, and they were doing a series of instructions there, and they came to this one church and they had a whole bunch of black pastors there. And these pastors, one of them came up afterward and said, "What kind of monkey do we come from?" That's what they had been taught. They came from a different variety, a different line of monkeys than the white people, who Darwin considered to be a superior race, right? And racism then was firmly based on this idea of Darwinian idea of evolution. Well, I have another example of that. A man that I've read his past and heard his testimony. He said when he was 14 years old, he grew up in the Bahamas. He was a black man and a kid at that point in time. And he had a white teacher. He said 90-some% of the students were black, but the teachers were mostly white. And this teacher told him directly that he was uneducable, that he came from monkeys and he was not as evolved. And this guy went home, he told his mom that. She said, "Don't you ever believe that." So he came up, 14-year-old, came up with the idea, well, if this teacher says he can't educate me, I will educate myself. And he began to study. He took the textbooks and he started studying and studying. He told his mom that. She said, within 6 months, he went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class because he now was teaching himself. And he was reading what was not only textbooks, but other things too. And so years later, this man, Miles, he has PhD, he became a leader in leadership training, among other leaders. And he was in a talk in Great Britain, and he was signing books for people many years later. And he saw this guy come up with an old tattered book of his first book. He wanted him to sign it along with the new one. And as he recognized, this man came up, and it was that teacher who had told him he was uneducable because he was black. Racism had a very firm foundation in Darwinism at that point. This man, Dr. Miles Monroe, got up and came around and gave this professor a hug. He says, "Do you still think I'm not educable?" He was able to be very, very successful. And so he said, "Don't you ever judge somebody by the color of their skin." And so I would agree with that. Darwin didn't know about Mendel's work. Mendel's work came out a few years, well, actually not even a few years. It came out very, very close to the time Darwin's work came out. I've often wondered if Darwin had had Mendel's work, if he would have advanced the idea of evolution by natural selection, because Mendel's work explained a whole lot of what Darwin was trying to figure out. Now, Mendel's work showed how you can get various variability within a particular kind of an organism. And within the human race, if you start with two individuals with medium skin color, with the right combination of genes, you can get all the way from lightest light to darkest dark in one generation. Now that's very simplified. Obviously there's other things that enter in and differing factors, much more than two factors. But even with just two factors, you can get all that variation in one generation. And some of you are familiar probably with the Punnett square. And I find that some people love these things in biology and others hate them. I loved them. I thought they were great, very logical. But you can see there how we can get so much variation. And in fact, here starting with two parents, medium skin color. Look at their babies, they're young toddlers. Two kids from the same parents, one very dark, one very light. And you can see as they grow up even, very different in their looks. Now, are they different races? They came from the same parents. That doesn't make sense, does it? From a evolutionary point of view. What we do see is there's variation, yes, but it's not coming from evolution. This simple genetics here. Here's an article published in 2017, How Africans Evolved a Palette of Skin Tones. I'm just going to give you a couple quotes here. Researchers agree that our early Australopithecine ancestors in Africa probably, notice that word, probably, had light skin beneath hairy pelts. How did they know that? Does that come from scientific observation, or does that come from speculation? You know, they weren't there. Tishkoff's team found the story of skin color evolution isn't so black and white. I like that. He said the study adds to established research, undercutting old notions of race. You can't use skin color to classify humans. This is not coming from a creationist viewpoint, by the way. This is just in Science magazine they printed it. Then they say there is so much diversity in Africans, there's no such thing as an African race. A lot of diversity, isn't there? We as believers in the Bible and a biblical approach would tie in the racial characteristics to the event, a historical event described in the Bible as the Tower of Babel, at which time God separated. And this is history, this is from the biblical history, where the different people groups were separated out, went different directions to fill the earth. And I believe at that point in time is when we start seeing the concentration of various, what we call racial characteristics. And it happened within family lines and so on. Well, here's the real question then. According to evolution, how do you get new genetic information? Because Darwin didn't know that. Darwin thought, well, it came from whatever. He kind of believed in Lamarck's ideas. He really didn't know, but he was famous for the idea of natural selection. But today, or over the years, as Darwin's theories have become entrenched more and more, the idea of mutation was added in. So mutations generating new genetic information, and those that were good then being saved by natural selection. That's pretty much what the model is today still. But here's the kicker on that. Neither mutation nor natural selection are creative mechanisms. They can only operate on what's already there. If you're going to mutate a gene, you've got to have a gene to mutate, right? You've got to have something there to start with. You don't just change molecules and have this complex DNA come about by accident. And so it takes something already there. And then if you're going to select, that already means there's something there, right? You can only select from the traits that are there. You can't select for something that isn't there. It's kind of like if somebody offered you orange juice or apple juice for breakfast, you're not going to get grape juice out of it, because you have to have something if you're going to have a selection. The question then becomes, according to actual observation, what do mutations produce? And this is really, science is based on what? Or should be based on observation and repeatable experimentation or statistical studies, right? You have to have observation. You have to be able to test it. You can't do that with evolution. If anything, it's a historical event. Nobody was there to watch it happen over millions and millions and millions of years. But what we do know is when we see mutations, we can see that they produce things like two-headed snakes and cattle with extra legs and roosters without any feathers and all sorts of fruit flies. You ever been in the biology department and they're doing experiments in genetics with fruit flies? You can't keep them in, can you? They escape all over the building. Look at the one down there on this corner. That one has 4 wings. That says normal fruit flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4. Now listen, this rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful. But then it says beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Well, then the question becomes, how do you get beneficial, and how do you know if they're beneficial or not? Well, the beneficial would be those that survive, right? Or those that have no apparent immediate effect. What we do know about mutations is they can result in duplication of information, like, producing a second set of wings, same as the first set, or it can result in loss of information, wingless flies, or you can observe that mutation causes a deregulation of genetic information, like you might find in cancer cells, or you might find aging and death as a result of mutation. I mean, you think about it, if you have a friend and they have a baby and they call and they say, yay, our baby was born with a genetic mutation. Do you all go, yay, yay, or, oh, that's too bad. I'm sorry to hear that.
because in overall, we know mutations generally are harmful. They're not generally helpful. And so in order to take evolution, you've got to weed out all of those harmful ones and keep the beneficial ones. But then the question becomes, are there enough beneficial mutations? Dr. John Sanford, who is a retired Cornell University professor, he did his research in genetics. He was the co-inventor of the gene gun process by which we could sequence DNA. And I mean, he has, you know, a whole lot more about genetics than I do. He started his research as an evolutionist. But as he looked at it, he's going, wait a minute, we cannot generate enough good mutations in order to fuel evolution. There's too many that are either bad or that seem to have no immediate effect, but overall time they're deleterious instead of beneficial. And here's one of the things he said then, is evolution proceeds by mutation and natural selection. He calls that the primary axiom of evolution. It's the primary way that people think that evolution takes place. And he says it does not work. He says mutational entropy. And that, what he's saying, entropy means a measure of disorder. He's saying mutations introduce disorder into an orderly system. He says that appears to be so strong, especially within large genomes, that natural selection should not be able to reverse it. And he's been doing the mathematical studies and so on. It's now clear that mutation and selection cannot even stop the loss of genomic information. So mutation and selection clearly could not create the genome in the first place. Careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. Now, what is that primary axiom again? It's evolution proceeds by mutation plus natural selection. Dr. John Sanford says, no, it doesn't work. I love this quote. He says in here, if mutation and selection cannot prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. He says it's not just implausible, it's not just unlikely, it's absolutely dead wrong. It's not just a false axiom, it's an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. Now, other geneticists may disagree with him. They may have a different view, but he is, remember, one of the very well-known and careful observers, Dr. Sanford. So how do you explain, then, the variations that you see? Dr. Galuza from the Institute for Creation Research, they've been doing a lot of research, and this is one of the criticisms that creationists often receive is, well, you're not doing real scientific research. You can go down to the Institute for Creation Research, you can go right there and you can see the experiments they're doing right there in their labs. They are doing research. Now, obviously, we as creationists do not have all the funding and everything else, so we can't do a whole lot. But they're keying in on some key projects, and this is one of them. Randy Galuza's idea was that, wait a minute, mutation and natural selection does not work, and so we need a different explanation. And some of the latest research coming out to explain adaptation is that it is not normal adaptation much as it is pre-engineered design to respond to environmental changes. Now, he is assuming something in this, isn't he? But he's going to be testing it. His assumption is there is an engineer who can engineer living organisms to survive, to adapt to their environment, that there's something in life that has been programmed in by the grand designer in order to survive in this world that we live in. And biblically, if you're a Bible believer, you can go look in the scriptures. Well, you can look even if you're not a Bible believer, but you can look, and God said after he created that the animals and humans were supposed to multiply and fill the earth. Well, if you're going to fill the earth, you've got to be able to move into all different sorts of niches. And the environment's going to keep changing and changing over time. And the Creator created these organisms with the ability to survive, because God is life, according to what Scripture says. They're doing research down at the Institute for Creation Research on blind cave fish. And of course, the model has been is because they lived in a cave and it was dark, and eventually they didn't need their sight there, and so they lost the ability to see. Well, as they're doing the fundamental research on these cave fish, they're finding out that they have many differences from the equivalent surface fish besides sight. So there already has some differences. The changes appear to be controlled by the water pH, among other things, not by the darkness, which is very interesting. So, what we've assumed to be just because they go in the dark, they don't need to see, so they're going to lose that ability. That may not necessarily be the case. These changes can be reversed when put into a normal surface environment. Now, I don't remember whether it can be changed, within one generation, or if the next generation, if they brought back into a normal environment, would go back. But what that shows is that these creatures are programmed to be able to see, and it's not a permanent change here. So we're seeing this is fundamental research that's going on. I'd encourage you to look into that over time, because they're doing some very interesting research there. So mechanisms for evolution, which have been taught to be mutation plus natural selection. I believe you cannot explain the origin of new kinds of living things with that model. I used to believe in evolution. I was taught evolution. I believed it. And I was taught all the classic examples of evolution. I have a biology major, and I enjoy genetics. But I've, over the years, come to believe, no, that doesn't work, okay? So the next big question with this whole evolution creation debate is, where do you get life in the first place? I mean, somewhere along the line, if you have molecules that eventually, if you start with nothing, with a big bang, and now you get molecules somehow, and then they have to get together and get bigger and bigger molecules, and they have to get together to form that very first living cell. Where did it come from? How is that possible? Has anybody ever done it? Has anybody ever seen it? And it's never been observed. It can't be observed. If it happened at all, it happened so far in the past, according to evolution. Nobody was there to observe it. And so, is that science really, or is that speculation? I say it's speculation, and here's why. Science is based, again, on what? Observation. And our observation of life over and over and over and over and over tells us it takes life to get life. Nobody's been able to produce life accidentally in a lab. You can't just throw chemicals in and have life come out of it. Even if they were able to get all the right conditions together and produce some sort of a living cell, virus, something, would that prove that's how it started? Not at all. It would just show that human beings have a lot of intelligence and are able to really do these kind of experiments. But as you look in the past, what do you see? Speculation. That's not science. This quote by Franklin Harold says, wishful speculation. We should reject. Now listen to this, because he's showing his worldview, his bias. We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. We must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. So first he's admitting that he has a bias, and then he's telling us there is no evidence for what he believes, but he's going to believe it anyway. Speculation. That's not science, is it? Now, science, we may not know, obviously, the purpose of science is to study and learn and to understand more about this world we live in, and we believe that's extremely consistent with the biblical mandate that God has given to human beings. We're here to steward God's earth. We're here to take care of it. We're here to be those who caretake, like somebody that might be hired to work on a farm to take care of it during the absence of the owner or something. We have a job to do here on this earth. And so we need science because it helps us understand what we're taking care of. With kids, little kids, I like to tell them, if you get a new puppy, you better do some study, right? You know what's good for that puppy to eat. And puppies need certain kinds of food. They need certain kinds of care. And so you have to learn in order to take good care of that puppy. In the same way, we as stewards of this earth need to learn about it so that we can take good care of it. So when we look at this whole big topic of change by mutation and natural selection, I do not believe that those forces are an adequate explanation of the origin of life or the development of life over time. And we could look at lots more examples, but let's move on to similarity. This is called homology. It's the idea that because things are similar, that indicates they had a common ancestor. Is that always true? No, not necessarily. I could have two little girls up here with long blonde hair. Does that mean they're biologically sisters or cousins? Not necessarily. They may be related way, distant. But just because you have similarities doesn't mean that you came from the same parents, does it? And I think you can extend that back. Let's look at some alternate explanation for similarity. And one, I believe, is design. Things would be similar if they were designed with a similar function in mind, like the chair you're sitting on. Similar to your dining room chair at home, similar to a recliner, similar to a seat in the airplane. They have similarities because they were designed for the same function. They have a seat in the back and some legs on them or something to hold them up. Similarity designed for the same function. Or maybe things are similar because they were designed by the same designer. We have one creator, not a whole pantheon of creators. And what we mean there is if you go into an art museum and you have a discerning eye, you can go pick out the Rembrandts because of the style and the use of color and so on. Similar because they're designed by the same artist. Or maybe another reason things are similar is they were designed to work together. We have a limited number of elements in this world to work with, and atoms, differing kinds of chemical elements. And if an ape or a monkey, you think about it, what do they eat? Same kind of stuff we eat, basically, right? And what kind of air do they breathe? Same air we breathe. So you would expect that you would find some similarities because we live in an ecosystem with a limited number of elements that we know of. This one was used a lot in the past. It showed gill slits in the yolk sac and a tail of a developing embryo within the human mother. And they say, look at the gill slits. Problem is they're not slits and they're not gills. They don't function for respiration. They're used to develop into the structures in the neck and the jaw region. Very important in human development. They're not leftovers from evolution. The yolk sac, why would you label it a yolk sac? Human beings don't need yolk. What that little sac does for humans is to produce the blood cells till they're big enough to produce in the bones and so on. And the tail looks like a tail, but you got a spinal column, it's got to end someplace, doesn't it? At this point in development, it grows a little more quickly than the rest of that little baby, and eventually it's just enclosed in the body system. We call it our tailbone, it's the end of our spinal column, but it's not a tail at all. So those things we can just, they're similar, yes, but you think about it, if you're a designer, think about an engineer that builds bridges. They're going to use the same basic structures, the same basic physical principles, aren't they, when they design a bridge or a big bridge like the Golden Gate Bridge or a bridge that goes across a small creek, you use the same basic physics and same basic structures, don't you? It's just different or specialized for what you're going to make. Ernst Haeckel back in the 1800s was a strong proponent of Darwinian evolution. And he came up with this big, long title, biogenetic law. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. You memorize that and people think you're educated, right? What does it really mean? It meant back then that the whole process of human development repeated the stages of evolution. So in the 9 months in the womb, as the little baby developed, that it would repeat the stages of evolution. So go through a fish stage and salamander stage, and later on through so-called higher organisms and so on, until it became human. Well, is that really true? It's not really true at all. In fact, as you look at the upper layer there of the diagram, they make it look like the diagram makes it look like the similarities are much greater than they really are, and a trained embryologist can see differences very, very early in development. So we can just say no to that. And even though this idea has been debunked for many, 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 many decades even, that this still shows up in textbooks, it still shows up in museums and places. It's really hard to get this stuff out once it's in, and it's not good evidence. The one they're using a lot today is biochemical similarity, or homology, the study of similarities. And here we would look at DNA or RNA, we look at the sequences of the nucleotides or the sequence of amino acids and proteins and so on, and study the similarities in those sequences. And then from that, they draw these trees of life. And supposedly the things that are closer in biochemicals must mean they're closer in evolutionary development. Well, is that true or not true? Years ago, Time magazine had this claim: chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. Well, that's not the best scientific journal to refer to, is it? But a lot of times this research gets, or scientific ideas get picked up and they put into the public like this. The claim was that they had this shared DNA, but as the years have gone by, that number's gone down and down and down. Back in May of 2025, not too long ago, the similarity looked like it was 84 to 85% similar. That's a lot different than the 97 or 98% they said. And yet in October 2024, an article came out of Evolution at Berkeley that said 98% still. So which is it? And does it really matter? I mean, if you think about it, the similarity that's there, you would expect similarity between apes and humans, but you would also expect differences, wouldn't you? Here's one we saw in a museum down in Texas. They said the similarity of humans to mouse DNA is 97.5%. So are we more similar to mice or to chimpanzees? Maybe we have mice in our ancestry. We all like to eat a cheese sandwich, right? Or what about zebrafish? They have this 92% there. And I love this one, bananas, 50% similar. So what does this similarity mean? We didn't evolve from bananas. Nobody teaches that. But there is similarity. Why? Because we have the same elements to work with. And we're using the same base, AC, G and T, as we've learned in genetics and so on. And you're just combining things. So I don't think it's really a good test at all. Back in 1985, a long time ago, Michael Denton came out with a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He's a molecular biologist. He was not a creationist then. And he said that in that book, and this is a long time ago, like I said, the really significant finding that comes to light by comparing protein and amino acid sequences is it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of evolutionary series. Well, as time has gone on, we see that this problem has not been solved. It's been called an elusive problem. with different analyses based on the same genes yielding a diversity of phylogenetic or evolutionary trees of life. It's not a clear-cut, the research has not been supporting the hypothesis of evolution. New Scientist had this article, and one of the things they published in New Scientist was Darwin's sketch of an evolutionary tree of life. He just put it in his journal. He's going, I think, look at that up there in the corner, I think, it's got Spanish on it because we do quite a bit of teaching in Spanish countries too. But he wrote in his journal, it was a speculation, he was just thinking about it. And New Scientist magazine published this article. It says, Darwin was wrong. For a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life. A few years ago, it looked as though that grail was within reach, but today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. What are they calling negative evidence? It's all the new research on DNA and the complexity of the whole biochemical system within living creatures. The tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, has turned out to be a figment of our imagination. Okay? We can treat it as a hypothesis, but to call it a theory that's been well demonstrated, or even, as some people say, evolution is a law in biology, it's not substantiated by the data. It is, many times, involves a lot of imagination. Now, I'm not against imagination, because you need a lot of imagination in science in order to come up with good hypotheses. A hypothesis is a question that you're trying to find out, right? And we want to be looking at how come this happens? Why? You know, we want to be like 2 or 3-year-olds who say, why? 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 You know? They're always wanting to know why. And they're good scientists oftentimes because they're observing the world and asking questions. That's what any good scientist would want to do, is to observe the world and ask good questions. But you're always looking to see, here's my question, here's what I think is going on. We can never prove it scientifically. All we can do is disprove it, really. You know, now some things we can get close. If we say Ivory soap floats, and 99 times out of 100 or 999 times out of 1,000, or, you know, you can test it, can't you? And all we got to do is have 1 or 2 times it doesn't float. We go, whoops, there's our problem, isn't it? Okay, then you might ask, well, I wonder what's different about that bar of soap. New Scientist says we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. Interesting. And then I love this quote, biology is vastly more complex than we thought, and facing up to this complexity will be scary. I don't think it's scary, I think it's exciting. I think it's really exciting to see the complexity of life, and as new evidence comes out, how complex living systems really are. So this tree of life is being dismantled based on science itself. What about the idea of junk? Quickly, as we look at junk, that was the idea that there were all these useless leftovers. And at one time they had a list of 180 different leftovers in the human body. There's probably, you could add to that, but they called them useless leftovers, vestigial. In other words, they were more important in our evolutionary past than they are today. Well, included on that list were things like the pituitary gland, which we now call the master gland of the Bible, often, or of the body oftentimes, don't we? The pituitary. And it's involved in regulation of all kinds of things within the body system. The thymus, the tonsils, the appendix were all on that list. Now we know they're all involved in immunity. Very important part of human body, not leftovers from evolution. Wisdom teeth, they call vestigial, like they're not needed anymore. Hey, they're just teeth. They're used for chewing. Sometimes in development, the jaw doesn't, and the mouth doesn't develop big enough and you know, anymore, and they may have to be removed. They may get impacted or abscessed. They have to be removed, but that doesn't mean they had no function. in the humans it seems to be related to diet early on in childhood. What about this? Junk DNA is the big one they were using in recent years. When this first came out, when they first sequenced the DNA molecule, they said that 97% of the DNA in a human being was junk. It was leftover from evolutionary history. And at the time, we were going, that doesn't make sense. Go back to the lab, let's look, let's find out. What does it do? It's not just junk. And so this is one case where I'm grateful the research came out a whole lot faster. John Sanford again said it's becoming increasingly clear that most or all of the genome is functional, has a purpose, has a plan. Back in 2012, there was an international research effort called the ENCODE project. And their purpose was to look at some of these areas that were called junk DNA or vestigial and see if there were any biochemical functions for that. Well, the end of the project, they said this: almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. The metaphor of junk isn't that useful. The key point is, it's not junk. In other words, the more that the research is going on, the more they're finding out what does 97% of the DNA they were saying was junk. You know? Now what we're finding out is, no, those sections of DNA have very major uses. They just are not directly coding for proteins as far as we know. Sections are used in repairing DNA or assisting DNA replication, regulating our DNA transcription, aiding in the folding of the chromosomes, very, very important, aiding in maintenance of chromosomes, controlling RNA editing and splicing, helping to fight disease. I like this last one, regulating embryological development. We wouldn't even be here if we didn't have those genes in what is called the junk DNA sections. And there's all kinds of articles coming out, lots and lots and lots about that research. It's not junk. Human genome, 20th anniversary, junk DNA hits the trash. This is by a creationist, Dr. Robert Carter. He says, the genome is a multidimensional operating system for an ultra-complex biological computer with built-in error-correcting and self-modification codes. There are multiple overlapping DNA codes, RNA codes, and structural codes. I'd recommend this. It's called the high-tech cell. Very interesting. You might be able to find it up on YouTube, I think, even. But it's very, very interesting. So some of you guys that are in computers, we need some computer experts to start studying the biological systems. So we're recruiting. What about this last one quickly? Imperfection. And the idea is, that imperfection is an evidence of evolution. And I'm going, wait a minute, we have scientists today who say, no, the eye is poorly designed. Darwin didn't think that. Darwin said, to this day, the eye makes me shudder. He knew that his theory of evolution by natural selection could not explain complex structures like the human eye. Now, he had faith that somehow, someday, it would be able to be explained. But when you start studying the eye, the complexity is just mind-boggling. And yet, Richard Dawkins goes, it's absurd design. I'm going, I think that's a pretty arrogant statement, personally. To think that we could make the eye better. How would we make it better? He had the idea, well, if the eye was designed differently, you could see better. But the problem was with his design, if you went out in the sunshine on a bright sunny day, you'd be blind within a couple hours. Our Creator has designed our eyes to function. And yes, things can happen to that design. You guys that are in computers also, you can work really hard to get your computer working, get a perfect program, right? And it doesn't take much to mess the whole thing up. And so things can go downhill much more easily than they can create this kind of complex interrelationship of parts. We believe that the evidence cries out, created with a design. Dave's you gotta show him this little quick.
Okay.
You gotta show him the morpho butterfly. You love morpho butterflies. The first time we went to Costa Rica, Dave wanted to see a morpho butterfly. He was fascinated with them. So I started praying, Lord, let him see a morpho butterfly up close. And guess what? We had a morpho butterfly landed right on his sleeve. The next time he moved up to his beard, I said, is that close enough for you?
I'm sure that was close enough. But anyhow, it's an amazing design feature of the blue morpho butterfly. By the way, it is not blue. It is, no, it's not blue. Basically, here's the underside of that particular blue morpho butterfly, and you find out that the top have clear scales that are as clear as your, well, my fingernails anyhow, okay? But anyhow, it's clear, but it's now every one of the scales has literally millions and millions of layers called laminae, that what happens is the light comes in, everything in the light spectrum is filtered out except the blue. Now what happens here? All of a sudden that blue is not just reflected out, but it is basically magnified out. We call it a color megaphone, okay? It's amazing to see what's going on there. And those particular layers have to be specifically spaced, otherwise this thing doesn't work. And that, to me, is evidence of amazing design, okay? But what's the answer that we might get all the time for no matter what design feature I will bring up to some people? It says, well, we can imagine how mutations, which are basically mistakes in the genetic code, mutations in natural selection acting over millions of years might refine or produce systems. Did you catch two words that are not scientific there? Imagine and might. All right, we all have to understand that. It is the, you might say, the faith of naturalism right there. And so the hero of the plot here then, according to the evolutionary idea, is mutation selection coupled with millions and millions of years. But when we look at John Sanford and all the research he has done as one of the top genetic researchers in the world, he finds out it doesn't work. That whole concept does not work at all. Let me just give you one example that mutation or natural selection, I believe, can't produce. Why? Because you have to have something living that can basically respond to the environment before anything could even think about working. Well, let's look at the molecular machines inside of every one of your cells. We're going to focus on one specific one, but understand there are over 20,000 types of molecular machines in humans. 20,000 types. And according to Dr. Kandel, these are real machines at the microscopic level. In fact, at the scanning electron level, basically, or better. It says there are folding machines, there are pumps, valves, force generators, energy producers, labeling machines, delivery, highway construction. Oh, I added that. But anyhow, over 20,000 types, what according to Howard Berg from Harvard University are the most efficient machines in the entire universe. Wow. That's what they're saying about them. Okay, others say one of the wonders of the molecular world. These are the people that make a living studying nanotechnology. And they see what's going on inside of the cell by very sophisticated processes. Let's talk about that one that makes energy. That's even better than that can of Monster. Okay? I love it too, but it's an energy producer inside of every one of your cells. And it's made up of 32 proteins. 32, get that. And it works just like a regular motor. But how do you get it? Well, first of all, you start with DNA. Something's got to untwist it. There's an untwisting machine. Something's got to go ahead and take a picture of the right section of the DNA. You call that a copy machine. It is then transported by UPS delivery into the ribosome, which is made up of 300 proteins, in order to make proteins, by the way, but made up of 300 of them. And you get this long chain of marbles, you might call them, or beads. And those are called amino acids. Now, in order for the protein to be viable or useful, maybe not lethal, they have to be exactly the right marble in the right spot on the entire chain. Okay? And some of these chains might be 200 amino acids in a line, 200 marbles. Others could be 4,000 of them. And you have to have them all in the right sequence. But now it's still not going to be a good protein yet for the synthase machine. It has to go into the folding machine to come out precisely folded. So once you get it folded, now what are you going to do? It's got to be perfectly folded. Call UPS. Okay? You call UPS again. And UPS delivery has to have a highway. Did you realize that inside of your cells there are highways? UPS delivery, for you scientists out here, kinesin transport machine, okay? All of that has to be working. And that kinesin transport machine is going to be trucking down that highway that has just been constructed to provide the right proteins over to the synthase machines. Now you see the sack of, that the guy is carrying? That's basically what's happening. And that is being delivered to the various parts of the cell. When I look at all of this and realize the intricacies inside of the cell that all have to be there and working properly, without any living systems, no mutation, natural selection could possibly work on this type of a system. What I see is design. I see a lot of design. And I don't see imperfection in all this stuff. I see amazing design. So what evolutionist answers have I heard? What have I heard to be able to produce it? To produce that amazing, complex computer system in our DNA, or in the highways, in the transport. What's going on inside the cell? Here's what I hear all the time. Even if, this is a quote from Dr. Scott Todd, and he basically says what so many are saying, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Wait a minute, remember, students are being put in a box, and you can only think in that box of naturalism. And those fairs stepping out and saying, wow, I see evidence of amazing design here. That's why I say this whole idea of naturalism, and Mary Jo keeps pointing it out, is a belief system, and it is posing as science. Boy, that gets me in trouble some places, right? If that's what it is. The probability of even getting one protein is one chance in 10 to the 260 power. That's like hiding a blue marble in a universe filled with red marbles and finding it 3 times in a row blindfolded without praying. Okay? I mean, that's the same probability. And if you could find that marble 3 times in a row, in a universe filled with other colored marbles, that'll be 100 million times easier than making that one simple protein. Now, I mentioned that one time in a college or university statistics class I was teaching. 5 minutes later, I heard from the department chairman, "I understand you're preaching religion in the classroom." No, I just showed the statistical improbability of proteins having evolved. He said, "Well, this creation evolution stuff is a touchy subject at this university. You had better drop it." I didn't, and that's why I can be with you today. Okay, it's amazing what's going on out there. You know, it takes a lot of faith that all this stuff happens strictly by accident. And remember, when you look at some of that stuff, you have to have all those pieces working and operating at the same time. I believe the evidence cries out, things were designed. I thought about it, yeah. What if Darwin had known about the inner working of a cell? What did he didn't even know about DNA. He thought it was a gob of jello, is what he thought. He didn't know about the DNA or the machines, the highways. He never knew that. What if he would have known that? Would he have still clung to evolution? That's a big question. Depends on how committed he was to the idea, especially that's presented today, of naturalism. I'd say, be open-minded. Any questions? Boy, did I quickly go through that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that one's hard.
Is this on?
This one is. Here you go. Use it.
Okay, so it's coming through this. Okay. Yeah, well, great presentation. Let's give the speakers a round of applause. Thanks a lot. So a couple people came in after we started, so I just wanted to quick review that we have flyers on the back of this event, on the back table, blue flyers, as well as flyers for our campus house. And so because we have 4 more presentations that are all unique, that kind of add to what they covered today, but in different areas. So again, tomorrow in this room, 12:20, we have, let's see here, paleontology. So was Darwin wrong about paleontology? And the subtitle there is Billions of Dead Things Buried in Rock Layers All Over the Earth, as a teaser. And on Friday, same time and place, geology, lots of time or lots of water. So all under the theme, was Darwin wrong? So we're going to do kind of comparison predictively of Darwinian evolution, what we should see, what do we actually see, and does it fit better with a special creation model? And then tonight, you're invited if you want. Like I said, there's flyers on the back and of the table. And we have our campus house flyers, which looks like that. And it's at 6:30 tonight. We have our dinner, Bible fellowship. So free dinner, and then presentation afterward. That's at 6:30, 315 10th Avenue Southeast. And on Saturday night, at the same campus house, we have our last presentation, which is Grand Canyon, A Different View. So we're going to look at evidence of creation and design in the Grand Canyon. So that being said, we're going to go into some Q&A. So Dave and Mary Jo, if you guys can come back up here.
Wasn't your daughter?
Oh, well, that's fine. Whoever you think is best. I know you guys can't handle the other person talking. You're going to want to answer, so you might as well come up here. But anyhow, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then we ask that you be brief in explaining your question, and don't give your own presentation, because we brought our speakers in here to answer questions. And we have this room reserved until 2, which doesn't give us a lot of time. We may go a little past that, because I don't think there's a pending reservation afterwards, but our live stream will probably cut off at 2 for those watching online. All right, so if you would like to ask a question, I'm going to let these guys do the Q&A, and please raise your hand.
Who wants to be first? I don't know, because, this phone, I guess.
It's catching it from here in the room. That's just live stream.
Okay,
But you can still use it. Please.
I can still use it, all right. I get it.
And if anyone wants to hang out and talk, if we don't have a formal Q&A, then we will just be hanging around the room and maybe out in the hallway. So if you want to engage, and that's more informally, we can do that too. Yeah, I thought of a question, but I'm just thinking about other things. I don't know if I have one for you guys. Yeah, go ahead.
Essentially, all adaptations emerge from
Don't necessarily say all of them do, but that they are a strong force in that process.
if that was outdated, 50% related to the internet and
Mhm.
Can you restate the question? Because I'm not sure the question
Okay.
picked up for the live stream.
Okay.
Try to rephrase it.
As I understand the question is, if it's true that epigenetics is important, at least in adaptation, why do we have different structure of DNA among different things? That's a good question, because the why question is always a very interesting one in science. You know, we can answer how oftentimes, or we can look at the way things operate, but why starts getting into the idea of intent. And from a creationist point of view, I would say because the Creator intended to create different creatures differently, so they're distinct, but they have a distinct role in the creation, with room for variation within that role to fill in that particular role that God created, or for that species, or for that kind even, which might be broader than a species. And so from evolution, if you ask that question, why, it all comes back to, well, it just happened randomly, and somehow the random things got saved. And so really, I think when you get into the why question, you get into more of a theological or philosophical question. I would say, according to my understanding of the scripture, that when God created, it says he created the various types of animals after their own kind, not one kind turning into another. And so he has a purpose and a plan for each type of creature that he made to fill a particular niche or a particular role within the creation. Now, we would have a hard time filling the role of what? A lion. We're not created to be lions. We don't run as fast as antelope, we don't swim as well as fish. And so each of the environments that we have on this earth, according to a biblical worldview, were created for a specific purpose and plan.
wrong with
Yeah, except we probably would not limit, you're saying the birds, for example, would be created with all the birds coming from a common ancestor. I wouldn't go that far with it, because the birds, according to scripture also, there's various types of birds. So we would be looking within the broad category of birds. We would have all these, we might equate them with maybe a genus, maybe even a family level within the birds. And that's an interesting thing, but then within that, there's room for variation. Same thing with the dog type, same thing with cat type. We see variation from that basic type. Now, the question then becomes, what are the boundaries of those kinds, right? How do we define a kind? And that's an area of active creationist research to look at. How would we define a kind? Right now, we define it more historically than we do scientifically, I think. We don't necessarily mean species. The Bible doesn't talk about species per se. Now, I know the Spanish Bible does. You know, they use the term species, but the word actually means a kind or a type. And some of the research that is being done is looking at maybe a different classification scheme either, or looking at it a little differently than what we normally think of taxonomy. We've been taught taxonomy, you know, at the genus and on up, family, phylum level, and so on, right? And I think it's basically a good thing. When that taxonomy was originally done, it was based more on morphological, physical characteristics. Then they started classifying things according to the supposed evolutionary ancestry. And I find that to be a problem because that's, again, a supposition. And then what you can do is you say, well, these two things, you know, they're in the same category, the same class level or whatever, and so they must be related or evolved or something. And I'm going, wait a minute. That's how you get things that are widely diverse that you look at and you go, there's no way that those things are similar, you know. And so creationists are looking at what are the levels of those classifications. What would you define as kinds, the particular kinds? And it might be, in some levels, we believe it's more at the family level, according to current classification schemes. At others, it might be more at the genus or species level. And so it's not set, you know, according to our definition. When you think about it, taxonomy is an organization system for us to try to make sense of this world, right? And so we put things together that are sort of similar, and you know, and we can then introduce genetic studies along with morphological studies too. But it is an area of active research. Some creationists have coined the word baraminology, coming from Greek or from the Hebrew. Bara means created, and min means kind. So it's trying to look backward from where we are now to look backwards and figure out what those created kinds were.
One of the surprising things in all this whole research has been that they're noting that a lot of that stuff that was called junk DNA, because they didn't have any idea what it was for, but they're now finding out it is actually being a help in the epigenetic, going back to your first time question. And how does it work yet? I don't know. Okay.
That's one of the things we love about science, is that science always changes, because science is really based on what we as human beings have been able to discover, and it's based a whole lot on what questions we ask. And the difference is if you're philosophically committed to naturalism, you're going to ask different research questions. Like there's a layer in the Grand Canyon, in the Red Wall. There's fossil layers that have been found, nautiloids, millions of these fossils. And the evolutionary geologists said, why didn't we ever see those? And the creationist geologists said, because you weren't looking for them. And so you tend to see what you look for. It's just natural. And so the research that's being done, I think we need to recognize we have a worldview. And if we're willing to admit our worldview, and we're willing to say that we have a worldview, and that our questions are coming from a different direction maybe, you can still do primary research, and it's being done, nowhere near the amount of research that's being done in the evolutionary worldview, because we don't have the funding, we don't have the number of scientists working on it. But there are very good scientists, and every few years they have a international creation conference where some of these scientists will submit their original research, and it's peer reviewed, and they come together and have a scientific conference. People say, well, why don't you publish in the peer reviewed journals? Well, what we have observed over the years is a lot of times if you don't come up with the same bias, interpretation of the data, it won't get published, even though your data may be good. And so that's not 100% the case, because there are creationists who have been able to publish things.
Oh, yeah.
Oftentimes they have to use a pseudonym in order to get it published. But, it is a problem. I would love to just see people be able to do scientific research and publish it and put it out there, and people honestly look at the data and see what where it leads. There's another Nathaniel Jensen, PhD, paleobiologist, I believe, and he's been studying things about the similarities of Native Americans from early on, from a genetic point of view. It's fascinating research, and he's finding some very, very interesting things based on two different lines of research. One being actual historical research, and the I hate to call it myths, but the history, the myths and legends that differing Native American tribes have about their past history and what they say. And then he's tying that to genetic research, which is fascinating. And looking at the comparison, because really science is one way to find out things, but history is also another way to find things out. And so by taking the two and saying, where do they overlap, where do they coincide, we've got two different witnesses, you might say, to the same, when it comes back to the same event. Say that again, a little louder, maybe.
Do you agree that
Not from one kind, but from one designer. Yeah, but this is the thing, is we understand and we're willing to say we believe that there is an intelligent creator,
Right.
and that he has revealed to us in the Bible the basic history of the world. It's not everything. The Bible has a particular reference point to it. And what we're not trying to prove the Bible to be true based on science. But at the same time, we're saying it is a historical record and claims to be the word of the Creator, right within the document. So the question is, if it was the word of the Creator, it should correspond with what we actually see in nature, right? If the Bible claims that there is this Creator who created everything very complex, interrelated, with a purpose, with a design, then we would expect to see evidence of that. And so, yes, when we see complex, interrelated structures, to us that does indicate design. But it's similar to if you were to, it'd be similar to going down the street and finding a watch on the sidewalk. Or watch, or a cell phone, okay? It's laying on the sidewalk, and you pick that thing up, and you're going to go, well, you wouldn't think, oh, that thing came about by accident. You would look at the design, and you would immediately attribute it to a human designer, right? And so in the same way, when we see evidence of such complex, amazing design among not only one kind of living organism, but more multitudes, practically, well, any kind of living organism we see complex, interrelated structural design, and so it turns our mind towards towards a creator with intelligence, because we know that nature itself, things that happen by accident do not normally produce something better. Now you could come up with, well, in this instance it made something better, but overall, as we look at accidents, they don't make things better, they make things worse.
Before we get back to your question, are there others as well that might have questions?
Kind of really quick one about, you were mentioning how life only comes to life. Heard that in the past, they tried to create life.
Yeah.
And that it essentially just kept itself out. But have there been, you talked to that briefly, and then have there been anything more recent?
Well, that was way back when they did the Stanley Miller experiment.
That was in the 50s.
That was clear back in the 50s. And that's basically stopped right there. They found out that, wait a minute, you have to have a different atmosphere. We can't reproduce that atmosphere. We have to have a trap. You're getting the wrong kind of stuff left to itself. In that same contraption, it just turned into tar-like stuff. It's not making life, period. And so basically, all of those indicators would indicate that it did that particular very famous experiment from the 50s doesn't work, okay? And they're still trying to come up with a possibility. How could life come from non-living organisms? And I think it's still at a dead standstill. It's a hard one to explain. I believe you can get life by creator, okay? And that takes my faith, okay? But it takes a lot more faith to believe that somehow or another that you've got the right amino acids in this mixture, and only right-handed or left-handed instead of a mixture of them. And you have all these little details, and yet it's just an amino acid that was produced. Now, what do you have to do to get life? You have to turn a bunch of amino acids into long strings to make a protein. But the problem is it takes DNA made up of proteins, it takes ribosomes made up of approximately 300 proteins, and all this in order to get one protein. We know that from our research, okay? And so it becomes even more complex can of worms than what they thought it would be. And I think the problem is getting worse, not better, for those who would think about spontaneous generation of life.
We had a cartoon at one point, we saw that they had this mad scientist, his hair flying
Einstein
all
type.
over the place, and all this equipment around him, and he goes, if I can ever produce life in the test tube, it's going to prove it took no intelligence in the first place. I'm going, yeah, okay. Anybody else have questions? We'll come back to you if you have more.
Yeah, we just wanted to have other people who really want to have questions.
They probably
We
like
can
your
get back to you.
They
too.
probably like your questions.
Yeah, that's
you
fine.
have
You're
good
great.
questions. You've thought them out well.
But loudly, please, so they could hear and I could hear.
So, would you argue then that complex biological or
I would.
in evolution is like that?
Yeah, but then the question comes back to where did it come from in the first place? I mean, you have to eventually come back to the Big Bang, right? And we'll talk about that maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're not.
Well, according to
But-
Discover Magazine, Big Bang, at first,
It said
right
that.
on the front cover, which is the magazine committed to naturalism, by the way, right on the front cover, there's a quote in a box, and it says, Origin Universe. At first, there was nothing, and then it exploded.
And you
And
go,
as it got bigger,
thing explodes.
it got filled with more and more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere.
Now, that's
That
not,
was a quote. It was, how is this possible? But then they give an idea, ask Alan Guth, whatever, but it's just a hand-waving type of argument there. At first there was nothing, then it exploded. I thought, that's not too scientific.
yeah. You see,
Even if it goes against my reason. And I think God put in us reason,
yeah,
okay?
and the ability to observe. And I mean, if we take the argument and we can go back and back and back, and we can say, okay, maybe this particular species of fish evolved from less developed fish, from what? And you keep going back and back and back and back, right? Until you come to, okay, then where did life evolve? And I know a lot of biologists will say, we're not talking about that. We're only talking about once we have life.
Yeah.
But for us, that's still not a satisfactory answer, because even if you got what would you think would be the simplest life, even to get a simple cell, supposedly simple, you can do the statistical calculations. It's impossible by anything in statistics. And don't teach that, though. You might get fired.
Yeah, that's
Like
right.
Well, he didn't get fired. He just didn't have his contract renewed. Same thing, basically. But it was the idea when he said, I don't know what they teach you in the biology department about these kind of odds, but in statistics, we call it zero. And so, in the end, you're going to come down to faith, one way or another. You have to. What else do you come down to? Either life had a creator, or it came about randomly, accidentally, without a creator, or it all just popped into existence from absolutely nothing. You know, and if you're going to think logically, now you can believe what you want to believe. I mean, that God has, in our theological viewpoint, okay, our understanding, God has given each human being the free will to choose. But we don't have the free will to choose the consequences. I mean, if we make a certain choice, okay, I can say, I don't believe in gravity, right? So I'm going to jump off the building. I'm going to dive off these steps like Superman.
Yeah, right.
You know? Well, I
They
found
were
out
higher steps if you tried.
I wasn't trying, but consequences, right? There are consequences based on what? Physical reality in the universe we live in. And so if we have a choice to make, and as we look at it, we have come to the conclusion that what's taught in the Bible, what's taught about a creator from science, we believe we can see evidence of a creator. Now, how much evidence does it take? We flew here from Colorado yesterday. Could we prove when we got on that airplane, which if you think about an airplane, it's a collection of non-flying parts, right? What flies in the airplane? Not the wings, you know, not the seats, not the engines. None of that could fly by itself. It's creative design that puts it all together. The two guys up in the front, you know, two people up in front that are flying, did we have faith? We had to have faith to get on that airplane. Did we have 100%, could we be 100% sure that that airplane wasn't going to go down? No.
Gosh.
But we had faith, statistics good enough that we didn't think it was going to, or we wouldn't get on it, right? And so when it comes to, you can't prove scientifically creation or evolution. And it ends up coming back to that decision, then what am I willing to believe? Am I willing to believe in random chance accidents, creating a brain? If that's the case, you know, I don't know. To me, that's a stretch. I say, thank you, your faith is stronger than mine then, because I don't have enough faith to believe in evolution. I don't have enough faith to believe in naturalism or atheism.